The Arithmancer, by White Squirrel. Disclaimer: J.K. Rowling owns Harry Potter, and no one owns mathematics. Author's note: all maths in this story is real and correct to the best of my knowledge. Hermione's seemingly superhuman maths skills are based on real child prodigies. All arithmancy in this story, besides the tiny amount mentioned in the books, is stuff I made up. This story covers years 1 to 4. The sequel, Lady Archimedes, is in progress and will cover years 5 to 7. Chapter 1. The Magic of Maths. Hermione Granger had always been a very bright child. No, she wasn't go to university at age 10 material like those kids she saw on the news every so often, but she had skipped a year in primary with no trouble, although she had a September birthday anyway, so it hadn't been that big an adjustment. But maths, that was where she excelled. Oh, she loved books and all kinds of learning, else she could never have skipped a year, but numbers were her first love. She lived and breathed them from the time she first learnt to count, and her obsession had only grown with the passing years. Multiplying large numbers in her head was trivial. Anyone could learn that if only they would bother to take the time. No. Being able to do anything that a 4-function calculator could do, and often as fast, only made her a curiosity, not a prodigy. But that was just the start. As the years went by, private tutors began pulling her aside each day during maths lessons to teach her long division, then probability, then algebra, then trigonometry. She knew by the time she turned 6 that she was on a different plane entirely from her year mates when it came to numbers, and for all the trouble it caused for her, a part of her enjoyed the stares she got when people saw her happily working problems in GCSE and A-level maths while all the other children were learning their fractions. Actually, this past year hadn't been so bad. Since she had skipped year 4, she had advanced to secondary school a year early, and the kids there were at least a little more dedicated to their schoolwork than in primary school, where she had never really fit in and spent more time reading and doing sums than playing tag or, heaven forbid, dodgeball. She'd even found a couple of girls at secondary school who shared her love of epic fantasy and science fiction, although she had to go all the way up to the 6th formers to find anyone who could keep up with her in maths. Still, after some rough years in primary school, things were really looking up. Then, Hermione's world was turned upside down when a woman who was dressed like she had stepped out of a 1930s film showed up at the Grangers' door. Their hotel room door. Mr. and Mrs. Granger. Yes. Daniel Granger answered warily. How do you do? My name is Minerva McGonagall. She offered her hand to shake. Is your daughter here with you? Dan only lightly shook her hand. Yes, she is. Is there a problem? Not at all, Mr. Granger. You see, I represent an exclusive school in Scotland for gifted children, and we would like to extend an invitation to a Miss Hermione Granger to attend. Really? Minerva caught a glimpse of a head of bushy brown hair as the girl in question leapt from her seat and ran to the door, only to be blocked by her parents. Now hold on there, Hermione, her father said, then to their visitor. So you tracked us down on our holiday out of the country just to invite her? Minerva had been wondering about that herself. She was still a bit queasy from the international portkey she'd had to take to get to Italy, when she could surely have waited a week and caught them in Britain. Still, procedure was procedure. This was the hardest part, though, convincing them to let her come in and that she wasn't what had that Dame Finch Fletchley called her? A wandering lunatic, she believed it was. My apologies for interrupting your holiday, she continued, but it is our standard practice to contact all of our scholarship recipients in the final week of July, regardless of where they're staying at the time. Here is my card. She handed over a Muggle business card that said, Hogwarts School. Minerva McGonagall, Deputy Headmistress, and showed a Muggle post address while in public. If it is inconvenient, I can come back another time. No, Dan said quickly. The card at least looked somewhat verifiable. If it was true, they might as well listen to her, and if there was any funny business, it was best to get it out of the way quickly. Please do come in. He turned around and subtly motioned for Emma and Hermione to stay back from the strange woman and offered her a seat. He sat in between them and McGonagall, and by the room phone. Just in case the strange woman tried anything. Ms. McGonagall. My name is Daniel Granger. This is my wife, Emma. And you seem to know our daughter, Hermione, he said. I'm sure you can appreciate how unusual this seems to us, but I suppose we might as well hear you out. I appreciate that, Mr. Granger. Emma examined the business card. I don't think I've ever heard of a Hogwarts School, McGonagall, she said. Do you have any actual documentation with you? I do, Mrs. Granger, Minerva answered. You would not have heard of it before because the full name of the school is Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Dan's and Emma's mouths hung open, but Hermione spoke up for the first time. Witchcraft and wizardry. Do you mean like magic? Real magic? Yes, Miss Granger. Magic. I am a witch, and our spells have told us that you are as well. Hermione's eye grew wide at the revelation, but her father's narrowed. McGonagall, I think you've said enough. Please, Mr. and Mrs. Granger, I know this sounds difficult to believe, but if you'll permit me to give you a demonstration. The strange woman pulled a small stick from the sleeve of her dress. A magic wand. Dan said skeptically. His sense that this was a prank or a scam rose even higher. He knew enough about supposed psychics and paranormal practitioners to know the usual tricks. Quite so. Perhaps a simple levitation charm. No doubt to be performed with an invisible thread, Dan thought. But there was one thing that didn't add up. Just where was this McGonagall woman planning to go with this? She couldn't fake an entire school. If it was a school for stage magicians or something like that, why try to recruit Hermione, who had never shown any interest in the art? And if it was a prank, who and why? And if it wasn't either of those, well, Daniel Granger was nothing if not curious. Hermione hadn't got it all from her mother, after all. In the unlikely event that McGonagall could do anything besides make a playing card spin in midair or turn her wand into a bouquet of flowers, it really would be worth hearing. All right, then, let's see it, he said. McGonagall waved her stick and muttered something in what sounded like dog Latin, and then the coffee table in middle of them rose into the air. Holy! Dan fell right out of his chair. That was a lot more than a playing card. Emma paled at the sight, and Hermione gasped in surprise. He ran his hands all around the table, over and under, looking for wires or invisible supports. But how? As I said, Mr. Granger, magic. The table spun around twice in the air and then settled back down to the floor. Wow. Hermione said. Magic. Emma stammered. Magic. So. Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, you said? Emma stammered. That's right, McGonagall answered. I am deputy headmistress of the school as well as professor of transfiguration. Transfiguration? Hermione asked. Spells to change one thing into another. For example, she touched her wand to the coffee table and muttered another incantation. The table turned into a large tortoise. Dan very nearly fell off his chair again. That was definitely no trick. He pinched himself. Not dreaming, either. Hermione actually applauded the sight. Once McGonagall restored the coffee table, Emma said, So you're saying Hermione can do those things, too? She will be able to, with appropriate training, of course. That was a very advanced spell, but how could you possibly know that she's a witch? The word sounded insulting, but it was hardly the strangest part about this whole thing. We have very ancient spells in operation at Hogwarts that automatically detect all magical births within the shores of Britain, Mrs. Granger. But surely you have noticed yourselves unusual things happening around your daughter, what we call accidental magic. Dan and Emma looked at each other, and they both instantly knew the answer. It certainly explained a few things, including one particularly nasty temper tantrum in which a whole room full of books had come flying off the shelves. They just nodded, but Dan started up again. Well, if that's the case, why wait until this school of yours starts? I assume it starts at 11 or 12. Why not contact us earlier? That was another issue that always seemed to come up. McGonagall tried to explain it gently and hoped the conversation wouldn't devolve into a political argument. Hogwarts accepts all magical children who have reached the age of 11 and makes its first contact with them the summer before their first year because children rarely have much ability to control their magic before age 11. Because of this, for children with no magical relatives, then, there is very little reason for them to have contact with the magical world. I admit there are drawbacks to our system, but as you can probably guess, the magical world values its secrecy, so we choose not to make contact until later. This seemed to placate the parents for the moment. But as she watched her parents digest this information, Hermione was just getting started. She held out her hand towards McGonagall and said, Please, Mom, may I try a spell? McGonagall chuckled at the girl. That particular question was surprisingly rare, even from Muggle-borns. No. I'm afraid not, Miss Granger, she said. A wand must be specifically suited to your own innate magic, or you will find it very difficult to use, especially at your age. You will need to purchase your own wand before the term begins. However, I can give you your official Hogwarts acceptance letter. She pulled an envelope out of her handbag and levitated it over to the girl. Hermione was almost entranced by the old-fashioned envelope. It was made of parchment, she noted, and addressed with flowing script in emerald green ink. She took it in hand gingerly and read the front aloud. Miss H. Granger, the smaller bedroom, Suite 405, Hotel San Zulian, Venice, Italy. Dan shot to his feet. How did you know what room our daughter was sleeping in? Minerva sighed. This was happening more and more every year. Perhaps it was time to change the addressing spells. I did not know, Mr. Granger, she said. The letters are addressed automatically, so you can just automatically find anyone wherever they are. For the most part, yes. There are ways of concealing one's movements when they are called for, but that's hardly the concern of a student. In any case, tracking charms like that are strictly regulated. Grumbling, but mollified for the moment, Dan sat back down. Hermione broke the ornate wax seal and slid the letter out of the envelope. She read, Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, Headmaster, Albus Dumbledore, Order of Merlin, First Class, Grand Sork, CHF. Warlock, Supreme Mugwump, International Comfort, of Wizards. Dear Miss Granger, we are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Please find enclosed a list of all necessary books and equipment. Term begins on the 1st of September. There will be an orientation for incoming students of non-magical parents held at 9 a.m. on the 27th of July at Platform 10, King's Cross Station, London, at which time you will be able to submit your enrollment forms. Yours sincerely, Minerva McGonagall, Deputy Headmistress. Your orientation is in a train station. Emma asked. That is the beginning of the orientation, Mrs. Granger. The itinerary will include a tour of important magical sites in London, as well as time to purchase school supplies. McGonagall dug into her handbag again, raising eyebrows when her hand dove in deeper than the size of the bag, and pulled out a large brochure. I have some basic literature on Hogwarts here for you. Classes offered, extracurricular activities, profiles of the professors, and so forth. That's very helpful. Thank you. Do witches actually wear pointed hats? Hermione exclaimed as she read the lists of school supplies. I admit they are falling out of favor, but they are still part of the uniform. Yes. We may have a problem, Dan said as he reread Hermione's acceptance letter for himself. We were planning on flying home on the 27th. Is it possible to do the orientation later? McGonagall blinked and adjusted her spectacles. It had been a while since something like this had happened. She considered her schedule and said, if you like, I can meet with you personally on the following weekend. Or, if you prefer, I can arrange to have your flight changed to a day earlier at no cost to yourselves. You can arrange. What do you mean? It's pretty hard to change flights at the last minute. With a barely discernible HMPH, the witch answered, well, I suppose it might be considered bending the rules a bit by Muggle. That is non-magical standards, but I assure you that we can do it quite easily, and above board. Emma wore a resigned look. Well, then, I suppose we won't have any trouble going back a day early. And I doubt we'll be able to keep Hermione from trying to get a hold of these magical textbooks for another week. Mr. Granger smirked at that remark, and a gleam flitted through Hermione's eyes. McGonagall couldn't help but think, Ravenclaw for sure, this one. But her thoughts were interrupted when the girl spoke up again. Excuse me, ma'am, but none of these look like books for non-magical classes at all. She's right, Emma said, thumbing through the brochure again. There's no English classes, no. What did you call it? Muggle history? And not any kind of sciences or maths that I've heard of, unless it's this Muggle studies thing. You've just got to have maths classes, Hermione insisted. Yes, just for starters, Emma agreed, although Hermione was sure to need maths instruction far beyond what any secondary school could provide. How is Hermione supposed to get a well-rounded education with classes so heavily biased toward magic? She wondered to herself how she had got to the point of stringing those words together. McGonagall held up a hand to stem the tide of questions. This was a common question, though not one to which she had an ideal answer. Now, then, it's not quite as bad as it may look just from the course listings. Most of our classes have an essay component that is graded on language as well as content, so English is certainly not neglected. For maths, we offer an elective Arithmancy class beginning in 3rd year that covers much of the same maths as Muggle Secondary School. I will admit that our curriculum is light on Muggle sciences and history. We must cater to the needs of our students, and nearly all of our students, including Muggle-borns, those from non-magical families, choose to live in our world. Our curriculum is designed to help our students succeed there. She held up her hand again for the obvious next question. You can of course hire tutors to cover the remaining subjects, and magical education is only compulsory up through the 5th year. Very rarely, we do have students leave after their 5th year to take an early apprenticeship or prepare for a Muggle university. If you like, I can put you in contact with some former students who have done so. Both Granger parents leaned back, digesting this information, though Hermione was still looking over the brochure and frowning. Well, I suppose all that does make a kind of sense, Emma said. At least she would keep her options open. What do you think, Dan? Dan stared at the ceiling. I think I'm having the strangest dream of my life, and I'd like to wake up, now, please, he mumbled. But on the off chance this is real, I can't see why it would hurt to go home early and go to the orientation. Hermione, what's wrong? He added when he saw his daughter's face. You don't have any maths the first 2 years. She said. Do you think I could test into the Arithmancy class, Professor? What? Test into? McGonagall sputtered. Well, that would be highly irregular. And I'm afraid that few students could do well in that class at your age, even clearly gifted ones like yourself. Oh, you haven't seen our Hermione around numbers yet, Professor McGonagall, Emma defended her daughter. I could show you what I've been working on, the girl said, and before McGonagall could protest, she had disappeared in a flurry of brown hair and soon returned with a large book that she opened to a spot a little ways in and presented to her. This is what Mr. Andrews has been teaching me this summer. I haven't got that far yet, though. I've only got up through differentiation of rational functions. McGonagall's eyes narrowed in confusion, then slowly grew to the size of saucers as she began to thumb through the book. It was a Muggle textbook, yes, but this was the kind of maths used in N.E.W.T. level arithmancy, and in much more detail. McGonagall had forgotten most of it, and she wondered if even Professor Vector knew all of it. My goodness. You can really do this kind of work? Of course. Hermione started to explain how to do one of the problems, but McGonagall cut her off. That's quite all right, Miss Granger, I believe you. Irregular it may be, but with math skills like these, you could teach the non-magical part of the class. I'll ask Professor Vector if she is willing to interview you for a possible Arithmancy placement before you come to Hogwarts. Hermione giggled at the name Vector. Thank you, Professor. With that crisis settled, McGonagall answered a few more of the family's questions about the school and gave them a brief overview of the magical world. She was sure they would need time to fully understand everything that had happened, just like all the Muggle-born families, but she confirmed that they would be at the orientation and promised to contact them through the hotel with their new travel arrangements. After she left the hotel room, she waited until she was out of earshot before allowing herself a heavy sigh and wondering why it was always the most studious children who caused her the most trouble on these visits. Minerva McGonagall returned to Hogwarts after a long 2 days of visiting Muggle-born families. As always, she was glad to be out of that Muggle dress and back in proper witch's robes. But it was too late that night to bother reporting in that night, so she didn't head up to the headmaster's office until after breakfast the next morning. As usual, she didn't have to knock on Albus's door before he called out a hearty, do come in, Minerva. She entered the office and sat down among the many twittering contraptions. She had long suspected that most of them were completely useless, but Albus simply ignored any such comments about them. Sherbet lemon? The headmaster asked before popping one in his mouth himself. No, thank you. So, the visits with the Muggle-born students took longer than usual, I see. Yes, Albus. One of them turned out to be on holiday in Italy. I had to register an international portkey and rearrange a Muggle aeroplane schedule to deal with her. Muggles travel so much these days, I'm beginning to think we should change our orientation procedures. Perhaps a consideration for next year. No other troubles, then? No more than usual, although I'll need to talk to Septima about that one as well. Albus's bushy eyebrows rose at that. Septima? For a first-year student? Why would her involvement be needed? Minerva allowed herself a small smile. Because if Miss Granger is as good as I think she is, Septima will want her for an apprentice before she's through with her. Albus stroked his beard. How intriguing, he mused. Good arithmancers are hard to find. Indeed. So no problems here, then, Albus? Only a spot of difficulty in contacting Harry Potter. At that moment, one of the devices on the walls chimed 6 times. Albus rose to inspect it. Oh dear, it appears that all 6 letters I sent to Mr. Potter this morning just triggered as lost. 6. Yes, this is the 3rd day in a row. I'll have to arrange another post to him for tomorrow. Albus, if 6 letters couldn't get through to the boy today, I can't see how sending more will help. If I had to guess, I'd wager those awful relatives of his are keeping them from him. Now, Minerva. I left specific instructions with them. Specific instructions, my foot, Albus, Minerva cut him off. I told you how awful those muggles were 10 years ago. Perhaps I should visit the boy in person. No, Minerva, you're doing quite enough this week with the Muggleborns. I think that if Mr. Potter does not read his letter before his birthday, I'll send Hagrid to deliver it, Albus said with that characteristic twinkle in his eye. Minerva had long ago decided that must be some kind of spell, but she couldn't for the life of her figure out what it was. I'm sure he'll be happy to see the boy again. Minerva thought about those prim and proper muggles' likely reaction to the half-giant barging in on them and smiled in spite of herself. Well, I suppose Hagrid is up to the task, she said. The last month of summer was a whirlwind for Hermione. First, there was the orientation at King's Cross, where she met Sally Ann Perks, Sophie Roper, Justin Finch Fletchley, Terry Boot, Kevin Entwistle, and the last-minute addition, Dean Thomas. Then, there was the wonder of Diagon Alley, buying her robes, her supplies, her wand. At her insistence, Mr. Ollivander had let her try a few simple spells in his shop, and of course, her textbooks. All of the books were fascinating, of course. She was surprised to find that several of the textbooks covered multiple years, making them even more useful. She bought the Arithmancy textbooks all the way up through 7th year, and even in the first one, she was amazed at how something as smooth and organic as magic could be broken down mathematically. She devoured the history books, too, trying to learn as much as she could about her new world. Her respect for Albus Dumbledore shot up several notches when she learnt that he single-handedly defeated Hitler's dark wizard ally in World War II. But she was a little unnerved when modern magical history described a terrorist who sounded like a comic book supervillain who was defeated by a boy named Harry Potter only a decade ago. There had been a civil war in magical Britain back then, against the Muggleborns. She was certainly glad that she didn't have to deal with that now. In the meantime, Professor Vector had been nice enough to arrange a visit to her house to meet her a week after the orientation. At the appointed time, Emma Granger opened the front door to find a middle-aged woman with long black hair who was dressed in a flowing burgundy robe and a matching pointed hat, much like the strange dress of many of the people they had seen in Diagon Alley. Emma looked the woman up and down once before saying, "You must be Professor Vector." Vector turned up her nose slightly and she answered haughtily, "And you must be Mrs. Granger. How do you do? I'm here for the interview with your daughter." Emma felt vaguely annoyed by the woman's demeanor, but quickly invited her in and started some tea. "Mr. Granger?" Vector shook Dan's hand. "How do you do? And you must be Hermione. Pleased to meet you, Professor Vector." "Thank you for coming," the girl said politely. Vector shook her hand stiffly. The child didn't look like much, all teeth and curls, not that appearances mattered. She was quite polite, though, and plainly excited, but to be honest, Vector wasn't expecting much. She was only doing this as a favor to Minerva. Despite what her colleagues said, she found it hard to believe that an 11-year-old could qualify that highly in arithmancy. They retired to the living room, where the family sat down, and Vector cautiously took a chair, eyeing the electric lights and the switched-off television curiously. Unlike far too many of her fellow Slytherins, she had no quarrel with Muggles, and she recognized how often Muggleborns outperformed their peers academically. There was something to be said for Muggle primary school, but she didn't think she would ever get over the culture shock each time she entered their world. "Thank you for the tea," she told Emma. "Now, Miss Granger, I, of course, am Septima Vector, Professor of Arithmancy at Hogwarts. Professor McGonagall informed me that you were interested in testing into my third-year Arithmancy class as a first year." Hermione looked nervous as Vector gave her a stern look, but she tried to answer calmly. Yes, ma'am. It sounds terribly interesting, and useful because it deals with spellcrafting, according to numerology and grammatica. And I really wouldn't want to go 2 years without a maths course. I want to keep it fresh in my memory. Well, she was certainly dedicated, Vector thought. Especially to have started numerology and grammatica already. You should know that I have never before considered early placement for my classes, she said. Arithmancy is a very rigorous subject, in my opinion, the most rigorous taught at Hogwarts, and I expect a full effort from all of my students, regardless of their age. Hermione started frowning. However, Professor McGonagall informed me that your mathematical prowess is the finest she has ever seen from a first year, and she insisted that I take a look. So if you could show me what kind of maths you have been taught, it would give me an idea of your possible placement. Of course, ma'am. I've got my calculus book right here. Hermione jumped up and grabbed the thick textbook from one of the stacks on the side table. She didn't see Professor Vector twitch in surprise at the word, calculus. She opened the book to the right section and said, "My lesson this week is differentiation of compound functions. In principle, it's a very simple application of the chain rule. You just treat the inner function as a variable when taking the derivative of the outer function, then multiply it by the derivative of the inner function. Of course, with more complex functions, it can be very complicated." Miss Granger. Vector cut off the enthusiastic child. "May I see that book?" "Of course, ma'am." She handed it over, and Vector looked over the open pages. The description of the chain rule was correct, of course, and as she flipped to the previous pages, she was amazed to see the elements of calculus explained in such detail. The N.E.W.T. level arithmancy book was smaller than this one, and the maths parts only took up half of it. And the child certainly acted like she understood it, which would be astounding if true. Vector needed to see this for herself. "Miss Granger, if I gave you an equation based on this material, would you be able to solve it for me?" "Yes, ma'am," she nodded emphatically. "Very well. Do you have any parchment?" Emma rolled her eyes. The fact that the magical world seemed to be stuck in the 19th century had not escaped her. "No, but we have a pen and paper right here." "Of course." Vector took the unfamiliar Muggle writing implements. Holding a pen should have been the same as holding a quill, but it still felt a little awkward. She began writing a formula for the Granger girl to differentiate. Just to be sure. She made it a fiendishly complicated formula. One that 7th years would struggle with, which required her to apply the chain rule twice, and on a rational function at that. A good student would try and probably get a mostly correct answer. A fake would be forced to give up at once. Very good, she said, handing the paper over. Perhaps this one. Then. Hermione paled when she saw the complex formula, but she set her face with a determined expression and got to work, leaning over the coffee table as she began figuring. Even watching it upside down, Vector could see that the girl was serious, much to her surprise. She was definitely doing real algebra and what looked like real calculus. It took 10 minutes of figuring, including checking her work twice and handing it back with a nervous look, but she finished it. Vector looked over the paper. In neatly written letters, Hermione had shown her work in great detail. The professor worked through each step herself, growing more and more excited as she found no mistakes. As she reached the end, she felt faint as her haughty, skeptical facade crumbled, and she was forced to conclude that the answer was correct. "Miss Granger," she said, "do you realize that the majority of my 7th-year students could not solve this equation correctly as quickly as you have just done?" Hermione smiled nervously, unsure what to say, but her father jumped in and said, "That's our Hermione. She's been doing secondary-level maths for years, now." "I should certainly say so," Vector said, any hint of superiority in her voice gone. "That is without a doubt the most extraordinary display of mathematical prowess I have ever seen from a first-year student." Hermione's smile grew broader. "Of course, arithmancy is more than just calculus. For example, have you learnt multiplication of matrices, Miss Granger?" "Yes, ma'am. That was in my Algebra 2 class." Vector didn't particularly know what Algebra 2 meant, but she took another sheet of paper and wrote down 2 grids of 9 numbers side by side. "I see. So perhaps you could multiply these matrices together, then?" "Yes, ma'am." Hermione took the paper and started figuring. Vector hadn't thought she could be more impressed with this child after the calculus display, but she was wrong. She knew full well that the problem she had given her required 45 arithmetic operations, and as she watched, Hermione worked it out, entirely in her head, in 45 seconds. It actually took Vector longer to check the answer than it had taken her to compute it. I don't know how you did that so fast, Miss Granger, but you are again correct. Well, then, I assume you have also learnt geometry and trigonometry. Yes, ma'am. Excellent. Vector drew up a complex geometric figure for which some of the distances and angles had to be solved. It required the use of both trigonometry and the geometry of circles, but Hermione made short work of it, giving the exact answers in terms of square roots. Well, Miss Granger, I think your mathematical skills are above reproach. Vector was conversational now, although she was not about to compromise on quality. However, if you place in my class, you will need to be adequately versed in the theory of magic as well. So, can you tell me why the wand motion is important when casting a charm? It was an easy question from magical theory, which Hermione had, of course, already read, and she repeated the book's explanation almost word for word. The movement of the wand aligns the ambient magical energies with those embodied by the charm's intended effects. This alignment of energies makes the charm much easier to cast, especially for beginning magic users. Very good. Something a little more difficult, then. What are the principal magical properties of the number 7? That was straight out of Chapter 1 of Numerology and Grammatica. Well, 7 is the most magically powerful number. More spells include an arithmetic factor of 7 than any other number, and in magical fields that include instances of sevenfold symmetry, the resonant energies often cause the magical effects to be more powerful and more stable. Numerologically, arranging objects in groups of 7 can. That's enough, Miss Granger, thank you. It's clear that you have read the course books very thoroughly. The important thing is that you can apply what you have learnt. For example, what is the geometric structure that describes the magical fields of the Lumos charm? That was one of the homework questions for Chapter 3. A sphere. Ma'am. And why is that? The Lumos charm produces light by confining the uncontrolled magical energies that produce sparks around the tip of the wand. The most efficient shape of the confining field is a sphere. Now that was the kind of magical intuition Vector was looking for. And she surprised herself that she really was hoping to find it. Here was one of the most extraordinary minds she had ever seen, and she really wanted to see what the girl could do. She asked a few more questions along these lines and then decided to see just how far she had got in her studies. All right, one last question, she said. What is the arithmetic difference between a jinx and a hex? Hermione paled, and she looked down at her feet. I don't know, ma'am. I thought that jinxes were spells that were just irritating, and hexes were spells that were actually harmful. That's quite all right, Miss Granger, this is actually a 5th-year topic. The answer is that while the definitions you will learn in defense class are roughly correct, jinxes are described using algebraic equations, while hexes, which are more powerful spells, are described using transcendental equations. Hermione's analytical mind started spinning at the implications of this, but she filed them away for future reference as the professor smiled and continued speaking. I must say, Miss Granger, in my 20 years of teaching, I have never seen a child with a greater aptitude for arithmancy at your age. I will inform Professor McGonagall to add 3rd-year arithmancy to your schedule when you arrive at Hogwarts. Yes. Hermione leapt to her feet and nearly tripped when she narrowly prevented herself from hugging the professor. Instead, she managed to restrain herself to shaking the witch's hand vigorously. Thank you so much, Professor Vector. I won't let you down. No, Miss Granger, I'm sure you won't. Vector looked back to the girl's parents. Her father was beaming with pride, and her mother looked more than a little smug. She probably deserved that, she admitted. She gave the family a brief outline of the full 5-year curriculum and answered a few more questions about Hogwarts and the wizarding world in general. She noted that Emma was quick to ask about career prospects, but of course she could say they were quite diverse for a skilled Arithmancer. As a bit of a courtesy, and a suddenly renewed curiosity, Vector asked a few questions about the Muggle world, and in particular, what they used their advanced maths for. While she only understood about half of their answers, that half was impressive. The applications to Muggle sciences were amazing, like that mission of sending people to the moon that Professor Sinistra always raved about. Equally impressive was Hermione's knowledge of these endeavors, even if they weren't up to her level in pure maths. When she finally took her leave, Vector shook her head and thought, "That girl's going to have my job by the time she graduates." Chapter 2. A Hat with a Mission. With her last reservations about Hogwarts dispelled, Hermione eagerly awaited the 1st of September. Her parents weren't as enthusiastic about sending her off to boarding school as she was about going, not to mention they were still trying to wrap their heads around the whole magic thing, but she could tell they were genuinely happy for her. They assured her that her calculus book would be enough to get her through Christmas when she asked for differential equations, though, and they made her promise to try to make some friends. Before she knew it, she was saying goodbye to them and boarding the Hogwarts Express. "Have fun at school," her mother told after her. "Be sure to write us." Her father lifted her heavy trunk onto the train. "Yes, Mum," she said as she climbed on board. "I love you." She waved to her parents and then walked down the train a ways, looking into the various compartments. She felt a little like the older students kept looking down on her, but she wasn't too worried yet. Secondary school hadn't been too different the first day. She found an empty compartment and went ahead and changed into her Hogwarts robes to get that out of the way. Then, she sat down and pulled out her copy of Hogwarts, a history, one of the books she hadn't got around to finishing yet. She'd read through all the course books, naturally, and even memorized the spell lists. She'd met a girl with a photographic memory at secondary school last year who once encouraged her to memorize whole books, but while Hermione's own memory was very good, it wasn't that good. With as much background reading as she was doing, it wasn't worth the time to read through everything 3 times to learn it by heart. A pair of first-year girls who looked to be close friends entered her compartment and introduced themselves as Susan and Hannah as the train got underway. They were both pure-blood witches, but they were nice enough. She asked them about the houses at Hogwarts. Both Susan's and Hannah's families usually went to Hufflepuff, but Hermione couldn't decide whether Gryffindor of Ravenclaw sounded the best to her. They chatted for a little while about the differences between their two worlds, but Hermione felt as if she was speaking a foreign language when she tried to explain electricity to them. She was about to give up and return to her book when a pudgy first-year boy showed up at the door with tears in his eyes. "Sorry, have any of you seen a toad?" he whimpered. "I can't find him." Susan and Hannah just shook their heads, but Hermione stood up and said, "No, there haven't been any toads in here." "Where did you last see him?" "Back at the end of the train," the boy said. "Well, let's look back there, then. I'll help you." "He's not that fast, is he?" "I don't know. I never see Trevor move very fast, but he keeps disappearing." He seemed to suppress another whimper. They looked in the first couple of compartments and didn't see anything. This would be easier with some kind of detection or summoning spell, but there weren't any of those that would be useful in the first-year books. "I'm Hermione Granger, by the way," she said, remembering her promise to make some friends. "What's your name?" "Neville," he said, and then, as if as an afterthought, "Neville Longbottom. Pleased to meet you." The next compartment they checked contained 2 first-year boys, a taller one with flaming red hair, and a small, skinny one with messy black hair. He should really try to comb it, Hermione thought. "Has anyone seen a toad?" "Neville's lost one," she said, but she didn't even hear the red-headed boy's reply when she noticed that he held his wand in his hand. Maybe she could finally see some serious magic firsthand. "Oh, are you doing magic?" "Let's see it, then." She sat down. The boy looked taken aback. All right." He cleared his throat. "Sunshine, daisies, buttermellow, turn this stupid, fat rat yellow." He waved his wand, but nothing happened. The rat stayed grey and fast asleep. "Are you sure that's a real spell?" said Hermione. "Well, it's not very good, is it? I've tried a few simple spells just for practice, and it's all worked for me. And numerology and grammatica says that most spells aren't even in English because the syllable structure has to match up with the wand movements, and English has fewer syllables than most Western languages." "The syllable what, now?" the redhead said. But Hermione was still talking. "Nobody in my family's magic at all. It was ever such a surprise when I got my letter. But I was ever so pleased when Professor Vector said I could take Arithmancy to continue my math studies. I've read all the other course books too, of course. I just hope it will be enough. I'm Hermione Granger, by the way. Who are you?" She stopped short as she realized that she had been talking over the 2 boys at a mile a minute, and they were now staring at each other in surprise. "I'm Ron Weasley," the redhead muttered. "Harry Potter," the other boy said. Hermione's eyes widened. Of course, she had added up the numbers and figured out that Harry Potter would be starting at Hogwarts this year, but the scrawny boy in ill-fitting clothes in front of her was not at all what she had expected. All the books painted him as some great and powerful hero. "Are you really?" she said. "I know all about you, of course. I got a few extra books for background reading, and you're in modern magical history and the rise and fall of the dark arts and great wizarding events of the 20th century. Although come to think of it, now, how could they know anything about him if he really had been raised by muggles like they said, and no one had seen him for the last 10 years? Am I?" said Harry, looking dazed. "Goodness, didn't you know? I'd have found out everything I could if it was me," she said. Harry just shrugged his shoulders. "Are you really taking Arithmancy?" Neville finally broke his silence. "That's a third-year class." "Oh yes, Professor Vector came and tested me and she said I could start it right away as an extra class." "Blimey," Ron interrupted. "Why would you want to take an extra class?" "Well, that settled her opinion of Ron Weasley. Because it's ever so interesting. I've been taking extra maths classes all through primary school, and Arithmancy uses a lot of maths. And in the 5th year class, we even get to invent our own spells. Anyway, we'd better try to find Neville's toad before we arrive. I expect we'll be there soon." The two of them went on to the next compartment. "Do you know what house you'll be in, Neville?" she asked. "Probably Hufflepuff," he said sadly. "But my gran wants me to be in Gryffindor like my dad." A couple of compartments later, they finally found his toad, and the boy shook her hand and thanked her profusely. That problem solved, Hermione began to wonder how much longer it would be. It was getting dark outside. Well, nothing for it, she thought. She worked her way to the very front of the train, past the first car that held the prefects who were not on patrol. She made sure to memorize as many of their faces as she could in case she needed help later, until she reached the conductor. "Excuse me, sir," she called to him. "Could you tell me when we'll arrive?" We're almost there, lass," the conductor said. "About 20 more minutes, we'll be at Hogsmeade Station, thank you." She hurried back to her compartment to get her luggage, but as she approached, she heard a commotion. There was shouting coming from a few cabins down. As she approached the cabin, the one she recognized as containing Harry Potter, a prefect came from the other direction, and suddenly the door burst open. A smarmy-looking blonde boy and two larger, tough boys came storming out towards her down the hall. They pushed past her roughly with the prefect following close behind, shouting at them. How childish, she thought. She ducked into the cabin to escape the chaos only to find it again on the inside. The two boys' piles of sweets were scattered all over the floor, and Ron Weasley was picking up his pet rat by the tail. "What has been going on?" she said. "And why are you hurting your poor rat? He won't feel it." "Those gits knocked him out," Ron said, examining the rat closely. "No, wait, I don't believe it. He's gone to sleep again." He set the rat back on the seat. "So you've met Malfoy before?" he said to Harry. "Malfoy?" Hermione said. "Is he one of those boys that—" "Yeah, the little blonde ponce," Harry said with surprising annoyance. "I ran into him when I was getting my robes in Diagon Alley. He was all about how he wanted to be in Slytherin, and he kept making fun of Hufflepuff House and Hagrid and Muggle-born wizards." Hermione made a mental note to stay far away from Malfoy. "Everyone's heard about his family," Ron said darkly. "They were some of the first to come back to our side after you-know-who disappeared. Said they'd been under Imperius. That's the mind control curse, but a lot of people don't believe them. My dad says the Malfoys have been dark all the way back to the Conquest. Who was you-know-who, anyway?" Hermione asked. "None of the books I read would even print his name. Hagrid told me," Harry said, glancing at Ron, who seemed to brace himself. "It's Voldemort, but no one likes to say it." "But why?" "It's just a bad French pun. It's, ha," Ron said, surprised. "I never noticed that, but still, you just don't say it. You're Muggle-born, no offense, but you haven't heard the stories." "I've read the books," Hermione defended herself. The 5-minute warning sounded through the train, informing them all to be ready to go and to leave their luggage to be handled separately. "Sorry, would you mind leaving while we change?" Ron said. "All right. Oh, and did you know you've got dirt on your nose?" She was trying to be helpful, but Ron scoffed at her as she left. Since she didn't need to get her luggage, she decided to line up by the doors. She was glad she did, as a crowd was rapidly forming. The train slowed to a stop and everyone pushed out onto a small dark platform. A single lantern bobbed along the platform. It looked as if someone was holding it over their head, but when it approached the middle of the crowd, it amazingly rose up even higher, and Hermione found herself looking up into the face of the largest man she had ever seen. He was somewhere between 11 and 12 feet tall, she estimated. He must not be fully human. Not giant, though. She'd read about them, and they were even bigger, maybe half and half, though, if it were possible. He wore a huge, black, bushy beard and seemingly uncombed hair, and he boomed out in a rough-sounding voice, "Furs years. Furs years over here. All right there, Harry? This must be the Hagrid that Harry was talking about. Come on, follow me. Any more Furs years? Mind your step, now. Furs years, follow me." Hagrid led them down a steep, narrow path that appeared to be cut through a forest. Hermione thought they ought to put in handrails or stairs or something to navigate it in this darkness. She couldn't see any of the grounds from here, but then the path opened onto the edge of a loch, the water blacker than pitch under the starry sky. Beyond the loch was a high mountain atop which sat Hogwarts Castle, its windows glittering against the backdrop of stars. Even Hermione couldn't help oohing at the beauty of the castle with the other students. She had read all about it on the train, and it was not too different from how she had pictured it, with its many turrets and towers, but it was huge, 7 stories tall, and the highest towers had to be over 200 feet, taller than any Muggle castle she'd ever heard of. Some of the architectural features she was certain could only be supported with magic. She barely noticed as she found herself in a little boat with Neville, Ron, and Harry, being entirely focused on the castle as it loomed higher and higher and drew closer and closer. The lake was as smooth as glass. The many boats barely made the slightest ripple. That must be part of the magic, too, she realized, and her mind blossomed with the possibilities for using magic to enhance the beauty of nature on such a grand scale. Trevor, where's he gone, now?" Neville cried, looking around the boat for his toad. "Heads down," Hagrid ordered. They all ducked as they reached the entrance to a cave and passed through a curtain of ivy. They were in a long dark tunnel, but Hermione thought she saw glints of light off the wall. She let her eyes adjust and saw angular shapes. Crystals. They were in a crystal cave that would have to be incomparably stunning if it were lit properly, but the wizards seemed to be all but ignoring it. They sailed far enough in that they must be underneath the castle when they reached a small underground harbor. The harbor was lit by a few torches, but they still only gave a haunting hint of the splendor of the walls of quartz surrounding them, though she supposed that, lit as if by starlight in the flickering flames, it had a kind of subdued beauty all its own. She saw a large staircase rising from one side of the harbor and another dark tunnel extending directly forward. The first years clambered out of the boats onto rocks and pebbles and little bits of quartz. Hermione discreetly picked up a few of them and put them in her pocket to look at later. She had an odd feeling about them. Hagrid, she noted, found Neville's toad again, not in their own boat, but in a different one. Hagrid was about to lead them up the stairway, when Hermione stepped forward and pointed down the dark tunnel. "Please, Mr. Hagrid, where does that go?" "That? Oh. That goes to the foundation stones of the castle, of course," the huge man said, as if that explained everything. She added it to her mental list of things to look up in the library when she had the time. Hermione estimated the stairway to be about 200 feet high based on what she had seen of the cliff outside, winding up through another dark passage that slowly morphed from quartz to granite as they climbed upwards. Hagrid took the steps 3 at a time like they were nothing, but the group of 11-year-olds behind him quickly began to tire. Luckily, there was a landing about halfway up where the stairs doubled back that was large enough for them to rest for a few minutes. Hermione was very glad now that she didn't have to carry her own trunk. It was hard enough with these heavy woolen robes. The stairs came out in a small, grassy courtyard just at the edge of the cliff. If Hermione's sense of direction hadn't failed her, the dark tunnel to the foundation stones must have ended up under the largest tower. The students staggered out into the open and up to the great oaken front doors. Even Hagrid looked small against those doors, but he still made plenty of noise when he raised a fist the size of a bowling ball and pounded on them 3 times. The doors swung open in a rush, revealing Professor McGonagall. Hermione sighed with relief when she saw the familiar witch standing in the entranceway wearing an elegant emerald green robe. The first years followed her inside, their footsteps echoing in the enormous entrance hall. The sheer scale of the place was incredible. The marble staircase that rose up to her right was probably the broadest she had ever seen after the Spanish Steps in Rome. She could hear a drone of hundreds of voices somewhere up ahead, but Professor McGonagall first led them into a small annex near the doors in order to explain the sorting, the houses, and the house cup. This was probably a review for most people whose parents had gone to Hogwarts or who had read the brochures, but it was good to remember. How exactly do they sort us into houses? Harry asked Ron. Some sort of test, I think. Fred said it hurts a lot, but I think he was joking. A test? Hermione thought. That seemed unlikely since they all knew little to no magic. And it didn't seem like the houses were ranked like a test would do. And they certainly wouldn't hurt the students to sort them, would they? All the other first years looked very nervous, and Hermione was finding it was contagious. She guessed it was some kind of tradition not to tell the first years how the sorting was done, a tradition she was approving of less with each passing moment. She whispered the spell lists she had memorized to herself to calm her nerves, but this only made the others around her more nervous. Then she screamed. She felt embarrassed at once, as she had read about the Hogwarts ghosts that afternoon, but it was still jarring to see pale, transparent spirits floating out of the wall and gliding on toward the feast. Dead people. That was going to be hard to get used to. At least she wasn't the only one who screamed. Harry had leapt about a foot in the air, and yet, what a wealth of knowledge. Some of them had lived centuries ago. Between the ghosts and the magical portraits she had read about, there was probably more history to be told than was contained in the library. McGonagall soon returned and led them out of the annex and across to the double doors of the Great Hall. Hermione had been waiting to see this most of all, and she wasn't disappointed. It was easily the most magical place she had yet seen, and her anxiety at the impending sorting was momentarily forgotten as she took in its splendor. The long wooden tables were impossibly luxurious, with golden, or at least gold-plated, plates and goblets. The professors were lined up at another long table at the head of the hall, and at the center, the most powerful wizard in the world, Albus Dumbledore himself, sat on a golden throne. Above the tables, floating candles filled the hall from just over the students' heads to the ceiling, a little over 9,000, at a quick estimate, filling the hall with a warm, homey sort of light. They flickered as the ghosts floated through them, seemingly oblivious. The ceiling itself was velvety black and dotted with stars just visible through the candles. It was so well camouflaged that it looked as if the hall was simply open to the heavens. Astronomy class would be wonderful here, so far from any cities or towns, or, indeed, anyone who used electricity. The girl behind her elbowed her, and she looked forward again to see Professor McGonagall placing a wooden stool and an old, patched-up, dirty witch's hat at the front of the hall. There was complete silence, and she wondered how a hat could be part of the sorting when a seam on the hat ripped open and it began to sing. The Hogwarts sorting hats, musical skills left much to be desired. Hermione actually winced at the loyal toil rhyme. But when the song ended, the hall burst into applause. She politely clapped along. Then McGonagall called the roll. Hannah and Susan went first, back to back. Sure enough, they both went to Hufflepuff. Hermione admired the brilliant simplicity of the sorting process, even if she was a little unnerved by the idea that a hat could read her mind. Seriously, there's nothing hidden in your head the sorting hat can't see, sounded kind of creepy. Seamus Finnegan went to Gryffindor. After the hat sat on his head for nearly a minute, and Hermione's apprehension grew again. What if the hat couldn't sort her? What if the hat threw her into Slytherin, where all the unsavory characters seemed to be going? She barely noticed as Anthony Goldstein went to Ravenclaw. And Gregory Goyle was almost instantly sent to Slytherin. Granger, Hermione, McGonagall called. She ran to the podium, mainly because she was so tense that her only other option was to turn on her heels and run away. She jammed the hat on her head, and it immediately shouted out, "Rav," then stopped. No, perhaps not. The hat murmured in a voice only she could hear. "Excuse me, Mr. Hat," she whispered, or perhaps she only thought it. "What's wrong with Ravenclaw?" A little to her surprise, the hat answered, "Oh, you would be great in Ravenclaw, no doubt about it. I haven't had the pleasure of sorting a mind like yours in over 50 years. But I do not send students to the house where they would excel with ease, but to the house that they need to realize their full potential. And there is more than raw brain power in your head. There is a spark of something greater. A spark that must be cultivated, and for that job, you'd better be Gryffindor." Hermione smiled with relief to be sorted into one of her two preferred houses, even as she began to ponder what the sorting hat had said. The students applauded, especially the Gryffindor table, but as she placed the hat back on the stool, she was sure she saw a faint look of surprise on Professor McGonagall's face. Unbeknownst to her, at the high table, Professors Vector and Flitwick also wore looks of surprise, while Dumbledore appeared thoughtful. Hermione all but skipped to the table and sat down next to the tallest of the red-headed boys, whom she recognized as the prefect who was chasing Malfoy on the train. A set of red-headed twins were sitting opposite him, and a ghost with a nasty cut across his throat was a little further down. "Congratulations on making Gryffindor, Miss Granger," the prefect said quietly, offering his hand to shake. "I'm Percy Weasley, fifth-year prefect. Pleased to meet you, Percy," Hermione said in between sortings. "I met your brother, Ron, on the train." "Oh yes, Ickle Ronnikins," one of the twins said. "Do hope he makes Gryffindor," the other twin said. "Can't imagine what would happen if he were in Slytherin. The green would clash horribly with his hair, not to mention Mum would kill him." "Fred. George. Cool it," Percy scolded. They paused as the hall applauded for another student. "But congrats on Gryffindor," the one she thought was Fred said. "Yes. Haven't seen the hat change its mind like that before," George added. "Classes haven't even started, and she's already shaking things up, brother." "Indeed, a woman after our own hearts. A pleasure to make your acquaintance, Miss Granger," the twins said in unison with a small bow of their heads. "Pleasure," Hermione replied uncomfortably. Seriously, were these two reading each other's minds? At the front of the hall, McGonagall said, "Potter, Harry." Silence descended, only to be broken by a rising wave of whispers as the skinny, messy-haired boy slowly walked up to the stool and put on the hat. The hat's seam was undulating strangely, and, watching closely, she could see Harry's lips moving. He must be having a conversation with the hat, too. She wondered what he was saying. After about half a minute, the hat screamed out, "Gryffindor!" The hall erupted with shouts and cheers far louder than anyone else had got. The whole Gryffindor table shot to its feet, and Hermione was caught up with them, applauding for the extremely relieved-looking boy who was now making his way toward them. Fred and George started loudly chanting, "We got Potter! We got Potter!" And Percy reached out and shook his hand vigorously before Harry finally sat down next to her. The last few students were sorted. Hermione clapped loudly when Ron was sorted into Gryffindor and sat on Harry's other side after being congratulated by his brothers. And finally, Blaise Zabini went to Slytherin. It was then that Albus Dumbledore rose to his feet, smiling broadly, his arms spread wide like Moses, his long hair and beard shining silver as if they had been charmed to glow in the candlelight. "Welcome," he said. "Welcome to a new year at Hogwarts. Before we begin our banquet, I would like to say a few words. And here they are: nitwit, blubber, oddment, tweak. Thank you." Hermione sat still, her eyes wide. This was the greatest wizard alive? The chief warlock, supreme mugwump, and defeater of Grindelwald. Is he a bit mad? Harry asked Percy uncertainly. "Mad?" said Percy airily. "He's a genius. Best wizard in the world. But he is a bit mad, yes." "Potatoes, Harry?" Hermione looked down at the table to find a marvelous feast had appeared in the blink of an eye. 7 kinds of meat, piles of vegetables, ketchup, gravy, and peppermint humbugs. Not her first choice, but still, the rest of it looked delicious, and it most certainly was. Until she took a sip out of her goblet. "Ugh," she said, screwing up her face. "What is this stuff?" "Pumpkin juice," Percy said lightly. "Pumpkin juice? You'll get used to it." She was about to respond when she witnessed something even more disgusting. The ghost across the table nearly removed his head from his body. Hermione raised her napkin to her nose and mouth and took a deep breath to prevent herself from losing her dinner when she'd barely started it. Hermione had seen pictures of dissections in her parents' medical textbooks, but she definitely didn't need to see it in person. Desperate to change the subject back to something, well, living, she turned to Harry. The boy barely seemed disgusted at all by the blood-stained ghosts. In fact, he was scarfing his food. It made her wonder a little, since he was so small, not unhealthy, as far as she could tell, but definitely small. "So what did the sorting hat say to you?" she whispered to him. "Huh?" He looked at her nervously. "I saw your lips moving. I was wondering what you talked about." I'm sorry, it's all right if you don't want to say. Harry swallowed and took a swig of pumpkin juice, grimacing only a little at the strange drink. Did it talk to you? He said. Aha. It said I'd do well in Ravenclaw, but it wasn't what I needed. Harry looked surprised at that, and he cautiously whispered so that no one else could hear. It said I'd do well in Slytherin, but I asked it not to put me there. You can do that. Well, I think if you didn't want to go there, it probably wasn't right for you, anyway. Harry seemed to accept this and went back to his steak. As soon as everyone was done eating the dinner, dessert appeared on the table in amazing variety. Finally away from her parents' watchful eyes, Hermione helped herself to ice cream, apple pie, and a chocolate eclair. So, Miss Granger, Percy said, perhaps a little patronizingly. Are you excited for classes to start? Oh, yes. I do hope they start right away. Professor Vector's letting me start Arithmancy this year, but I'm interested in Transfiguration, too. Arithmancy? Percy said in surprise. I've never heard of someone taking an elective early. You must be really good to have convinced Professor Vector. She's quite strict. Oh, you take Arithmancy? Of course. It's a very useful class if you're willing to put in the effort. You'll be starting small, though, predictions and probability tables, that sort of thing. What is it? Percy asked Harry, who seemed to have come down with a sudden headache. Nothing, Harry said, although Hermione thought it was strange that he immediately asked about Professor Snape, the potions master, afterwards. She filed it away for future reference. At last, the desserts too disappeared, and Professor Dumbledore got to his feet again. The hall fell silent. Ahem. Just a few more words now that we are all fed and watered. I have a few start-of-term notices to give you. First years should note that the forest on the grounds is forbidden to all pupils. And a few of our older students would do well to remember that as well. Dumbledore's twinkling eyes flashed in the direction of the Weasley twins. Hermione decided that she should definitely be careful around those two. I have also been asked by Mr. Filch, the caretaker, to remind you all that no magic should be used between classes in the corridors. Good to know, she thought. Quidditch trials will be held in the second week of the term. Anyone interested in playing for their house teams should contact Madam Hooch. And finally, I must tell you that this year, the third-floor corridor on the right-hand side is out of bounds to everyone who does not wish to die a very painful death. What? Hermione thought. What kind of warning was that? Wasn't that just inviting people to go up there? And why would they have something that could cause a very painful death in a school in the first place? And now, before we go to bed, let us sing the school song, cried Dumbledore. He gave his wand a little flick, as if he was trying to get a fly off the end, and a long golden ribbon flew out of it, which rose high above the tables and twisted itself, snake-like, into words. Everyone picked their favorite tune, said Dumbledore, and off we go. After that performance, it was easy to see where the Sorting Hat got its musical tastes. Hermione had done some music, and there were musical clubs at Hogwarts she had been interested in, but she now had to wonder about the quality of those clubs. They were dismissed, and Percy led the first years up to the Gryffindor dormitories, along the quickest route. Unfortunately, the quickest route involved going up staircases that liked to change, or had a vanishing step, walking through sliding panels and behind tapestries, and evading the castle poltergeist. Giving a password to the portrait of the fat lady was one thing, but the rest of it was just asking to get lost for days. Hermione resolved to try to get a map of the castle from someone, and if she couldn't find one, she would step off the corridors and start making one herself next weekend. Hermione was sure that she would get plenty of exercise at Hogwarts just climbing up to her dormitory. It was 7 flights up from the Great Hall to the common room and another 7 to her bedroom. Just our luck first years get the top floor this year, said a girl with curly, dirty blonde hair in front of her. I know, I can't believe they expect us to climb up and down these things every day, said one of the Patil twins, Parvati. She was pretty sure. I've heard Slytherin and Hufflepuff have all their rooms on the same floor. I'll bet Padma's got the same problem as us, though. Or, finally, the blonde-haired girl said. Hermione nearly ran into her as she reached the door. Oh, hi, I'm Lavender Brown, the girl said, turning around. Hermione Granger. Parvati Patil, the other girl said in as they opened the door. Their bedroom was nearly semicircular, with 5 4-poster beds lining the outside wall, alternating with windows. A small lavatory was visible through a door at the far end. A trunk had been placed at the foot of each bed, along with a calico cat sleeping on one of the beds. Hermione saw her own trunk at the spot nearest the door. "It looks like the beds are assigned," she said. "We can switch them if you want," Lavender offered. "No, thanks. I think I'm good." They stopped as they heard a huffing and puffing sound, and a moment later, two more disheveled-looking girls came staggering into the room supporting each other. "Sally Ann, are you okay?" Hermione rushed to help the ethereal, dark-haired girl she had met at the orientation. "I'd like to file a complaint with whoever designed this place," Sally Ann said weakly, spotting her trunk and making her way to her bed. The other girl, who wore light blonde hair in multiple, asymmetric braids, leaned against the door and explained, "That boy, Neville, tried to come up our stairs by mistake, and they turned into a slide. And we fell on top of him." "Oh, no," the other three girls groaned. "My name's Lily Moon, by the way," she added. The other girls all introduced themselves. "Pleased to meet you," Sally Ann told them wearily. "I'm gonna go to sleep now." She flopped down onto her bed and was out like a light. They watched her queerly for a moment, then turned their attention back to Lily. "Is that you, Cat?" Lavender asked, pointing at the calico. "Yes, that's Gwendolyn. Or, she's so adorable. Yeah, just watch out when she wakes up. She'll steal your socks." The other girls giggled. Hermione considered doing some more reading, but she found that she was so tired after the train ride and that big feast that it wasn't worth the trouble. She settled on organizing her books for the week's classes on her bedside table before going to sleep, wishing the professors would hand out the schedules more than an hour before classes started. Chapter 3, Arithmancy. Breakfast the next morning was served Scottish style with black pudding, lawn sausage, and tatty scones alongside the bacon, eggs, and toast. The floating candles from the feast the night before were gone, and the hall was brightly lit by the sunlight streaming through the windows and the blue sky on the enchanted ceiling above. Overhead, a whole parliament of owls came winging its way into the hall, delivering letters and the occasional parcel to students and professors alike. Hermione hadn't quite believed, or wanted to believe, that owls were the main component of the post system in the magical world, but she couldn't deny it now. Hermione sat near Percy again. The other Weasleys were scattered around a few seats away. Percy fielded a few questions from the other first years until Professor McGonagall approached him. "Mr. Weasley, the first year's class schedules," she told him. "Thank you, Professor," he said, rising to pass them out. McGonagall then touched Hermione on the shoulder and told her, "Miss Granger, your first class will be Transfiguration with me in classroom 1B on the first floor. Please come early. I will need to discuss your schedule with you personally." "Yes, Ma'am," she said, wondering if there had been a problem with the scheduling. She hoped there wouldn't be anything to disrupt her plans. She was snapped out of her thoughts by one of the second years across from her whispering, "There, look, next to the other Weasley, wearing the glasses." The boy's friend said. They were obviously talking about Harry Potter. "Yeah, that's him. I can't see a scar from here. Did you see it?" "Yeah. Like a lightning bolt, just like everyone says." "That's not very polite, you know," Hermione interrupted them. They stared at her in surprise. "Talking about him behind his back like that. It's Harry Potter," the first boy said, as if that made it all right. "So? He's just here to learn, like the rest of us." The second boy rolled his eyes. "You must be Muggle-born. And what's wrong with that?" "Nothing," the first boy said quickly. "It's just that you wouldn't know how important Harry Potter is to the rest of us. Well, he doesn't know it either. I met him on the train yesterday, and he said he was Muggle-raised." But there was a clatter as the two boys dropped their silverware and leaned toward her over the table, wide-eyed. "You met him?" the second boy said. "What's he like?" She groaned to herself. "You know, you could just talk to him like a normal person." She finished her breakfast quickly after that, trying to avoid being asked any more such questions, and trudged up to her dormitory for her Transfiguration book. She considered taking the whole stack, but she decided she'd never be able to haul them back up the stairs that afternoon. Most of those books were pretty big. She made it to classroom 1B at 8:45, easily the first student in the room, despite the difficulty of finding her way. There was only one fully enclosed connection between the residential and academic wings of the castle, and it was down on the ground floor. Professor McGonagall was waiting for her when she arrived. "Miss Granger." "Good," McGonagall said. "I have your class schedule here. There was only one small difficulty. The third-year Arithmancy class conflicts with the first-year Gryffindor Ravenclaw History of Magic class. Now, I was able to remedy this by placing you in the Hufflepuff Slytherin section, if that's all right with you. Oh, of course, Professor, Hermione said quickly once she realized she'd been asked a question. Good. I've placed your name on Professor Binns's roster for that section. However, as Professor Binns's memory for anything that's happened since 1954 is questionable on the best of days, it is possible that he may fail to recognize you or call on you. Please see me if you have any problems with him. Well, that was reassuring. Yes, ma'am. Here is your schedule, Miss Granger. I'll also write you a pass for Professor Quirrell's class so you have time to get your other books after this. Thank you, ma'am. Hermione took her seat and looked over the slip of parchment. She had defense, herbology, and history today. She would need her gloves as well as her books, and charms and arithmancy tomorrow. She balked when she saw Thursday. Astronomy ended at 2 in the morning, and she had to be up in time for charms at 10:30. Then potions only met on Friday for some reason, though the word on Professor Snape didn't exactly have her looking forward to that one. The other students began to file in, her fellow Gryffindors and the Hufflepuffs. Hannah and Susan waved to her as they took their seats. Ron and Harry were the last to arrive, running in and just barely beating the first bell. Then Professor McGonagall stood and addressed the class. Excellent. 5 points to Gryffindor and 5 points to Hufflepuff for everyone getting to their first class on time. She must have a very good memory to rely on a head count and skip calling the roll after having only seen most of them at the sorting, Hermione thought. Transfiguration is some of the most complex and dangerous magic you will learn at Hogwarts, she said. Anyone messing around in my class will leave and not come back. You have been warned. It is extremely important that you understand the fundamental rules governing transfiguration because it is easier here than in most branches of magic for something to go wrong. I want you all to write this clearly at the top of your notes and memorize it. She wrote in large letters on the blackboard. Some transfiguration is permanent, and some is not. Some transfiguration is permanent, and some is not, she repeated aloud. Hermione nodded to herself as she wrote the words at the top of her notes. This had been explained in graphic detail in the first chapter of A Beginner's Guide to Transfiguration, but it was serious enough to require a strong reminder. For example, McGonagall said, "This is not a permanent transfiguration." She waved her wand over her desk, and the desk changed into a pig. The class cheered and some of them laughed, but McGonagall held up her hand. They instantly fell silent again. "This is not a permanent transfiguration," she repeated. Left alone, it would change back into a desk within a few hours. Nor is it, in strictest terms, a pig, but only a magical construct that looks and behaves like a pig, and that only as well as my own knowledge of pigs allows. For any transfiguration, permanent or not, the result is only as good as the image in your mind. She changed the pig construct back to a desk and picked up the chalk again, writing a number 1 under the first line. Now, under this line, you will write the most important safety rules of transfiguration. First, transfigured food is not edible. Say that with me, please. Transfigured food is not edible. You will not attempt to transfigure any food in this class or outside of it. We will not be covering that topic. In most cases, it will be obvious that transfigured food is not edible from the taste and smell, which is why this is not an even more dire rule than it is already. But transfigured food may look right, it may smell right, and if it is done extremely well, it may even taste right, but it is not edible. It won't kill you unless it was transfigured from something poisonous, but it will make you quite ill, and we don't want to have any of that. Second, she continued, writing the next line on the blackboard, transfigured clothing will change back at the worst possible time. This prompted some giggles from the class, but McGonagall remained stern. It may sound funny now, but you don't want to have to worry about your robes untransfiguring themselves when you're outdoors in the middle of winter. You are not to attempt to mend or modify any clothing using transfiguration in this class unless you are specifically instructed to do so. Third, transfiguring money is illegal and will rarely fool anyone. I shouldn't even have to tell you that one. Most people can't make transfigured gold or silver last long enough to fool anyone anyway, but there always seems to be one person in Professor Dumbledore's alchemy class who doesn't get the message. It is illegal, and the goblins in particular do not take kindly to it. Some members of the class shuddered, having seen the goblins in action at Gringotts. Fourth, and most importantly, human transfiguration should never be attempted below N-E-W-T level. Again, human transfiguration should never be attempted below N-E-W-T level. Transfiguring any living subject is more difficult than normal, and human transfiguration is particularly dangerous when it goes wrong, although it is usually reversible. You will not attempt to transfigure any living subject unless specifically instructed, and you will not attempt human transfiguration on yourself or anyone else, even if instructed. Do I make myself clear? Yes, Professor. To their credit, every student answered. Minerva McGonagall's presence was that commanding, especially when she was talking about things that were usually reversible. We will revise these rules several times over the course of the year, and we will study in depth the consequences should they be broken. I expect all of you to keep them most scrupulously. I have not had any students permanently injured by transfiguration during my tenure at Hogwarts, and I do not intend to break that streak. Today, then, we will begin with the free transfiguration of a matchstick into a needle. This is not the easiest transfiguration, even with its small scale, because any kind of metal is difficult. But I believe in laying the groundwork early for the more conceptually challenging forms of transfiguration later on. Professor McGonagall spent most of the period explaining in great detail exactly how transfiguration worked on a fundamental magical level, the silent incantation for free transfiguration and how it related to the actual transformation, and the mental concepts of changing form and substance that were required to be held in mind to make it work. Most of the class seemed disappointed and impatient to get to the actual wandwork, but Hermione found it fascinating. It seemed to mesh together bits of Arithmancy, a dash of Muggle chemistry, a surprisingly large dose of Platonic philosophy, and practical magical instruction. Granted, most of it was in magical theory, but she thought Professor McGonagall did a better job of explaining it. With about half an hour left in the class, she finally handed out the matches. Free transfiguration was indeed very difficult, not like the simple charms Hermione had tried. She worked very hard, applying the silent incantation while focusing on the mental forms, just as McGonagall had said. By the end of class, she was dismayed to see she was only halfway there. She had succeeded in transfiguring her match into a metal toothpick, but not a needle. But she swelled with pride when McGonagall actually smiled at her and showed her results to the class. It was only then that she noticed that the other 19 students all still had nothing but matches. Hermione rushed down to the ground floor to get back to the West Wing and then up the 14 flights of stairs to her dorm to grab the rest of her books and got to defense class only a few minutes late. Her legs felt like lead by the end of it, though, and she was panting like she'd just run about a mile. She could tell it was going to be a long year. At this rate, she was worried might need to see Madame Pomfrey for muscle strain before the week was out, if there was even anything that could be done for that. She could see it was wearing on some of her classmates, too. Meanwhile, defense class itself meant sitting in a sickeningly thick odor of garlic while listening to Professor Quirrell stutter his way through basic principles of jinxes. Hermione had a very hard time giving him his due respect as a professor, since it looked like he wouldn't be able to defend himself from so much as a swarm of pixies if he had to. After lunch was herbology. Hermione had been dreading herbology more than any of her other classes since she was decidedly not the outdoorsy type. But she soon found there were advantages to a more hands-on class. Professor Sprout believed in taking fewer notes, since 1,000 magical herbs and fungi was about as good a reference as anyone could hope for, and instead focusing on the practical side of growing and working with plants. First year would mainly teach identification of common plants and the basic principles of gardening, primarily with non-magical plants, or at least plants that were known to Muggles, since an awful lot of them tended to find their way into potions. Hermione quickly learnt that being able to get some fresh air and work with her hands gave her a chance to relax and partially disengage her overactive, analytical mind. It wasn't what she was used to, but she enjoyed it much more than she expected. History of magic, on the other hand, was no better than defense. Professor Binns successfully called her name once on the roll and then called her Miss Grant every other time he addressed her, presumably after someone he had taught in 1954. She'd have to keep an eye out to make sure her grades got in correctly. He began lecturing at the very beginning, the earliest known evidence of magic. Stone circles unearthed in Turkey that were estimated to be 10,000 years old, twice as old as Stonehenge. Hermione had enjoyed a history of magic, but Professor Binns was so mind-numbingly dull that she could barely stay awake. The Hufflepuffs in the class could barely stay awake, too, and the Slytherins were too hypnotized to make any trouble, for which she was grateful. She was a little disappointed in the castle ghosts in general. It seemed like only Sir Nicholas and the Fat Friar were the only ones who were really talkative. She spent the rest of the afternoon checking out the library, partly for its own sake and partly so she wouldn't have to go all the way back up to Gryffindor Tower. The library was certainly impressive, and why not? Since there didn't seem to be any public libraries in the magical world, and the largest collection of scholars was right here. Why shouldn't Hogwarts have the most books, too? But even so, there were thousands of them. She did some quick figuring and decided that the Hogwarts library must have a majority of all the books on magic ever written in Britain, and there was quite a selection from Canada, the United States, and Australia, as well as a substantial foreign language section. She was pleased to see there were also extra copies of all the textbooks for all 7 years. Hermione ate dinner mostly in silence that night. Percy Weasley was already engrossed in his O.W.L. classes. He boasted about taking 12 O.W.L.s this year, which surprised Hermione since she thought one could only take 10 courses. Percy was suspiciously evasive when she asked him how he could schedule that. Fred and George also said hello to her, but she was trying to keep her distance from them, having heard of their reputation by now. Her fellow first years made small talk about their classes and complained about how much homework they had already. That was a lot like her secondary school all over again. She'd have to try to find some studious Ravenclaws to hang out with if she wanted to converse with people more on her level. In the evening, she sat in the common room and read up for the next day for a while before going to bed. She tried to talk to her roommates some, but Sally Ann was already falling asleep, Lily was busy doing her hair, and Parvati and Lavender, easily the chattiest girls in the room, were far more preoccupied with things like clothes, gossip, and Quidditch than schoolwork. So she gave up on that pretty quickly. Parvati Patil, present. Padma Patil, present. Sally Ann Perks, present. Harry Pot, eek. Professor Flitwick dropped the class roster and swung his arms in little circles as he lost his balance and toppled off the pile of books he was standing on with a thud. A few people laughed, but Hermione, among others, was concerned until she saw his hands appear on top of the desk and he climbed back to his feet. Terribly sorry about that, class, he squeaked. Now, then, Mr. Potter. Present, sir, said the shy, dark-haired boy. Professor Flitwick was obviously part goblin with his wrinkly bald head and bushy white beard. And at about 3'6", he was small even by goblin standards, but he was definitely very knowledgeable about his subject. The rumor was he had been a world-class dueling champion back in the day and had earned a Doctor of Sorcery in Charms. Much like Professor McGonagall, he began with a long lecture on the theory of charms. Transfiguration may have been difficult and dangerous, but charms wasn't exactly easy either. You had to say exactly the right words with the right inflection and rhythm, with the correct wand movement and a clear picture of the spell in your mind. The slightest slip of the tongue could produce disastrous and unpredictable results, although the magic became more forgiving with experience. Unlike Professor McGonagall, however, Professor Flitwick believed in starting with the very simplest spells and elements of wand handling. When it came time to start the practical lesson, he told the class to get out their wands and simply wave them to produce uncontrolled sparks. That was a lot of fun. Everyone's sparks were different colors, and sparks were flying all over the classroom. Some were only one color, while some were more than one, like Harry's red and gold, and Morag McDougal produced an entire rainbow. Neville Longbottom seemed to need to use a lot of effort to produce any sparks. He didn't get very many, and the ones he did were a horribly clashing purple and orange. Professor Flitwick then taught them the incantation to force their wands to produce white sparks, Argentius. This, Hermione deduced, was to help learn how to control their raw magical energy to cast the Lumos charm, which was the first spell taught in the Standard Book of Spells, Grade 1. Hermione's sparks were pretty close to white to start with, so the charm came easily to her. Professor Flitwick praised her work to the class and said that her natural color showed a high degree of magical control. After lunch, though, came the class she had most been waiting for, Arithmancy. She wasn't intimidated by going to a class with students 2 years older than her. She had sat in on the trigonometry class for a while last year, although the pace had wound up being too slow for her. But she did turn some heads as she walked confidently into the classroom. Professor Vector was already seated at her desk, and a few students from all 4 houses sat around the room. A tall and, if she did say so, handsome boy in Hufflepuff robes sitting near the door turned toward her as she entered. "Can I help you?" he asked. "What classroom are you looking for?" "This one," Hermione answered. The boy's eyebrows shot up, as did some others. "Miss Granger will be joining our class this year." "Mr. Diggory, is it?" Vector explained, checking her roster for his name. "What?" spat a black-haired boy in Slytherin robes. "She can't be in this class, she's just Firstie, Mr. Montague. I have interviewed Miss Granger personally, and I am confident that she can handle the material," Vector defended her. "And you will show appropriate respect." Montague settled in, grumbling, and Hermione smiled a little. With only Professors Snape and Vector and Madam Hooch from Slytherin among the staff, that house really didn't get as much internal control as it needed. Professor Vector, it seemed, made sure to do her part. Hermione sat down next to Alicia Spinnet, the reserve Quidditch chaser she had met at breakfast. About a minute later, a Ravenclaw wearing his hair long came in and sat on her other side. He looked past her and gave Alicia a questioning look. "Hermione Granger," Alicia whispered. She tested in. "Hermione, this is Roger Davies. He's on the Ravenclaw team." They nodded in acknowledgement to each other just before Professor Vector stood to call the roll. The class was nearly half Ravenclaws, with only 3 Gryffindors besides herself. With a few notable exceptions, most Gryffindors didn't seem to be the analytic type. "Welcome to Arithmancy class," she told them. Arithmancy is perhaps the most analytical and challenging branch of magic. It is not for those who are looking for an easy O, but it is also useful in ways that other forms of magic cannot hope to match. Most modern spellcrafting and even some potions innovations are done by Arithmancy. It forms the foundation for curse breaking, magic reversal, spell detection, and spell analysis. It is an integral part of alchemy and advanced astronomy, and an excellent aid to improve rune-based magic and wards. It is also used for statistical prognostication, which, in my humble opinion, is far more reliable than any other form of divination because it can be backed up with hard numbers, although I'm sure Professor Trelawney would disagree. Everyone but Hermione laughed. "We will mainly focus on arithmantic prognostication this year, since that requires the least complex mathematics, but we will also cover the mathematical and magical foundations of spell analysis and spellcrafting. These things can be quite tricky and must be done with great care, so I expect a full and focused effort from each of you. In particular, there is to be no fooling around with untested spells. Doing that is far more likely to land you in the hospital wing than anything else." Everyone nodded. Professor Vector's reputation regarding fooling around was similar to Professor McGonagall's. "I would like to begin the class with a short quiz," Professor Vector continued. She began to hand out pieces of parchment. "You will not be graded on it, and, indeed, most of you will probably not be able to finish it. It is merely to ascertain your level of mathematical instruction. I do this because students often come into this class with very different backgrounds in the subject. In fact, I've noticed that maths is the one area in which Muggle schooling consistently outstrips our own," she added, looking pointedly at the Montague boy who had called Hermione out. "Please begin. You have 10 minutes. Hermione looked down at the parchment and saw that the quiz, unsurprisingly, was just arithmetic and basic algebra. She could do this in her sleep, literally. She'd had dreams about more complex maths than this. Even checking her answers, she was the first to put her quill down after less than 5 minutes. There were some snickers from people behind her who thought the little firstie had given up, but Alicia and Roger weren't laughing. They could see that she'd at least written something. Professor Vector collected the quizzes and gave them a quick glance over, clearly just seeing how far people had got on them. She paused over one of them and scanned it from top to bottom, checking it against an answer sheet. Then she smiled at Hermione knowingly before continuing on, prompting some surprised and confused looks from the rest of the class. "Good. It looks like you all have a solid foundation in arithmetic, so we can advance straight into numerology and probability. Later, we'll get into algebra and geometry. The O.W.L. exam in Arithmancy requires proficiency in these topics as components of basic spellcrafting and spell reversal. In fact, the maths portion of the exam is remarkably similar to Muggle O-levels, or whatever they're called now. Should you choose to continue at N.E.W.T. level, we will study more advanced spellcrafting, an introduction to curse breaking, and the equivalent of Muggle A-level maths. that is, trigonometry and calculus. For a first look today, we will study the magical properties of the number 7 and the ways in which sevens appear more often in magic than you would otherwise expect. Hermione found the first lecture not to be very interesting, but sitting through a couple weeks of tossing numbers around would be worth it when they got to the actual magic. She quickly concluded that Professor Vector was more subtle than any of her other professors in the way she interacted with her students, but they seemed to be on the same wavelength. She never mentioned her score on the quiz, but Hermione was certain that if it had been anything less than perfect, she would have received a slightly sadder smile. No, really, Cedric. She wrote the answers in like 2 minutes, she heard Roger Davies say to the Diggory boy on their way out. Wait, there she is. Hey, Granger. When did you learn to do maths like that? He asked. Hermione blushed slightly as she tried to think back to her chaotic lesson schedules. That maths in particular. It must have been 2.5 years ago. Cedric, Roger, and Alicia, who was standing nearby, were gobsmacked. Cedric recovered first. I can see why Professor Vector let you in the class. Miss Granger, would you like to join our study group? You'll probably need some help with the magic, since there will be third-year spells. And you could help us with the maths. Hermione was tempted to point out that she wasn't going to do their homework for them, but Roger and Cedric, at least, seemed pretty bright about that sort of thing from the way they'd answered Professor Vector's questions in the lecture. Yes, I'd like that. Thank you, she said. Great. We were planning on meeting in the library on Mondays and Wednesdays after classes end. Oh, but when do your flying lessons start? I don't know. They haven't mentioned them. Hermione was not looking forward to that class. They'll be Thursdays for Gryffindors. Unless they've changed it, Alicia said. Well, that's fine then, Cedric said. So, tomorrow afternoon? Sure. I'll be there. Hey, Hermione, Parvati said when they made it up to their dorm that night. Why weren't you in history class today? Oh, I'm taking history with the Hufflepuffs and Slytherins. I have Arithmancy Tuesday and Thursday. Arithmancy? I didn't know you could take that in first year. Well, I met Professor Vector this summer and tested into third year. Wow, that's great. I was a little worried. I didn't think you'd be one to skip class. Ooh, did you meet Cedric Diggory? I think he's in that class, Lavender interrupted. Yeah. He asked me to join his study group. Parvati and Lavender both squealed loudly. Oh my god, what's he like? Is he really cute? Yeah, I guess. But he's really nice, too, and he seemed pretty smart. Hermione, that's awesome, Lavender gushed. Do you know if he's single? I don't know. We only talked about maths. Hermione said quickly. Padma said she thinks he's got his eye on Cho Chang in second year. Parvati replied. Ooh, tell me everything. The two of them soon devolved into a conversation about who was allegedly dating whom. Hermione rolled her eyes and went back to her books. Some girls, she thought.